We'll get started now. Thank you again for your patience. And a warm welcome. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director at Transform Finance, and I'm very glad to have you join us today for this second session of our discussion series on Grassroots Community Engaged Investment. For those of you that enjoyed the last one, you'll remember we went over some of the basics. You will find the video on our website as well as a quick recap of the main points. For today's session, the second of 7, as it stands right now, we'll be looking at the nuts and bolts of sharing governance. So we laid the basis a little bit for community engagement in investments. And today we want to see how does this shared governance really work? What does it look like in projects when the community is deeply engaged? But let's start perhaps first with a very quick refresher for you all. So by Grassroots Community Engaged Investment, or GCEI, we mean a process or a practice of investing that has meaningful input, decision-making power, and in many cases also an element of ownership by grassroots communities. What is important here for us, what we have been emphasizing in this work, is the move that we see that builds on a long-standing practice by communities of really exerting power, agency, and decision-making over decisions that affect them. One important part of this work, besides the impact that it has on the projects themselves and their success, is really the building of power in community, and conversely, the ceding of power by the investors or the philanthropic funders of the projects, such that the communities start building agency and power, or continue to do so, towards more equitable results. So it's important that this is not a field per se, right? We don't see this as a subset of community investment or mission investment. We see it as a practice, or even as a lens, an approach that one can take in order to really center the voices, the needs, and the aspirations of communities, and in particular grassroots groups within the communities. So that is very much the basics. I will turn it over to my colleague Kurt Lyon, that will walk us through some of the key features as well as some of the governance mechanisms. And I would be remiss if I didn't welcome also the representatives from the projects that are featured in the report. Many of them were kind enough to join us today. They will in particular be available if any of the attendees have questions as to the governance models of their project. I encourage you all to put your questions in the chat, not the Q&A, put them in the chat so that everybody sees them. And we'll do this quick presentation now with Kurt, and then we will turn it over to your discussion. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And definitely want to highlight again the folks who are in the room, and also who are not, who we really talked with to kind of get this bird's eye view of what all these different governance models look like. We're really excited to be kind of like digging into the nuts and bolts, so to speak, which follows up on the overview we gave last time. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to some rich discussion. I know there are a lot of really good questions remaining from last time as well. So yeah, let's get into it. So the key features of GCEI, so we did discuss these last time, but it's helpful for contextualizing, because today we're going to be talking a lot about this voice and vote concept. But these are really what makes GCEI. So looking at the initiation and who sets the goal of a project is really important, because in normal mission investment or community development, it is coming primarily from the funder or investor side, saying, okay, this is what the project is going to look like, this is what the financing is going to look like. But in all the examples we're going to discuss today, there's there's a mix of initiation. Sometimes they are funders and they bring in community groups. Sometimes they're totally bottom up from the grassroots. But in all cases, there is the opportunity for grassroots stakeholders, whether it's residents, grassroots organizations like tenants' rights groups or criminal justice groups or urban farmers. They're able to weigh in on how this project is shaping out. And that's really important, who gets to shape the goal of these projects. And going into voice and vote. So first, what do we mean by that? By voice, it's really taking into account who is given an opportunity to contribute their voice and their agency on what topics, on what terms, how is that kind of weighted with all the stakeholders that are involved in these complex investment projects. So really focusing on the who. And then the vote is really looking at the actual decision-making powers or kind of arrangements that are granted to those grassroots stakeholders who are representing a broader community that is usually excluded from these investments. So in particular, communities of color, working class groups, underinvested communities, whether that's by racial demographics or by geography, how are those groups actually like given the mantle to steer that capital? And we see it in two phases. This is kind of one of the big things that we were seeing when talking to all these projects. There's the design phase, so kind of designing the DNA of the product, and what's the fund or what's the real estate investment going to look like in the ultimate vision. And then how is that ongoing governance happening? Like, how can communities continue to bring their voice to the project to steer it one way or another, to make major decisions? You know, there's not just a launch and then everyone says good job. You know, there's ongoing decisions that need to be made throughout the life of a fund or a real estate development or a housing investment, whatever the project might be. And that's really the models that we're going to be exploring today, is how that governance is really institutionalized. And then lastly, but very importantly, there's also economic participation, which is not the subject of today's webinar exactly, but in a lot of these projects, there is elements of community investment. So people from the community contributing whatever money they have to have a stake in the project, that is often coupled with governance. We have the East Portland Community Investment Trust represented today. In the crowd, I see John Haynes there. So maybe there's an opportunity if that comes up to discuss that a little bit. Next slide, Andrea. So like I said, today we're really going to be focusing on the voice and vote here and what that really looks like. And again, that's really important because it creates buy-in from the grassroots groups, which makes the project more likely to succeed, more likely to align with the broader movement goals in that community. And that helps to create agency and power in the process. If you were on the last webinar, you remember we talked a lot about that power building as this kind of secret sauce, or like this secondary goal that goes beyond just what the investment is going into. And that takes the form of relationships with institutions like funders, community foundations, CDFIs, other types of investors. So building that relational capital. It builds knowledge and skills by playing with new concepts like investment, like capital, like community development, and bringing in groups who normally don't have the inroad into those conversations, but are very powerful in shaping on the ground conditions. And that builds that kind of like long-term capacity to do this work. And then it just directs more resources towards projects, businesses, whatever it might be, that are kind of like approved by the community, which means that like there isn't that kind of power dynamic of outsiders choosing where the resources are flowing. And last time we had a DT from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation talking a lot about this power component. We definitely see this voice and vote being kind of the flip side of fighting the bad. That the voice and vote allows grassroots stakeholders to kind of build the world and the community they want to see by having access and inroads to these capital these capital products, and then deciding how that aligns with other priorities. Next slide. So there's a lot of talk about what this actually looks like. There's a lot of talk about power. So just as a recap, we talked to 16 projects. Well, actually more. We ended up featuring 16 in this report, each in very unique contexts, trying to learn from the groups on the ground who are really building these models. So we are just trying to report back and give this overview. But importantly, all of the models we're going to discuss capture the community need through this voice and vote. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to reference some projects. I know some folks from those projects who are intimately engaged every day and doing this work. If you have something that you want to add, please raise your hand on the Zoom function, and Shantae or Sophie or Andrea will help lift up your voice while I'm going through this, and we can have you weigh in. And we're also going to have a Q&A sort of thing at the end where hopefully we'll get a lively discussion going. Andrea? So the first method of capturing this voice and vote that we want to talk about is this idea of a grassroots assembly. And this is like a really community organizing rooted process that you see in lots of other contexts, whether it's through policymaking or advocacy or just kind of neighborhood associations, but bringing in a wide group of community residents to help make decisions. A really good example of this is in the Boston Ujima project. Their fund convenes a wide membership base to make some major decisions for the fund. So electing boards, choosing which kinds of investments to make, what businesses should be invested or be a part of the fund's investment strategy. So very fundamental pieces. And that's really bringing in many folks from the communities that they're serving to make these decisions in kind of like these large event spaces. The pros of this method is that you get a lot of folks to engage. It builds a lot of excitement and buy-in, which is really important for having that deep rooting in what's going on and what are the main priorities in a given community. Of course, that means it's harder to bring all these groups together. The more people, the harder it can be to get that kind of group, especially if you're operating on like a quorum or majority vote of a given membership base. So it requires a lot of community organizing and prior relationships. That makes it harder for outsiders like funders to really like spearhead these kinds of community assemblies. So that's definitely something to be aware of for those like institutional partners, is you can't really fake the relationships that are required to have these deep ties to existing networks, whether that's church networks, grassroots organizations, neighborhood associations. But this is definitely a tool that allows input from a very wide group of residents to weigh in on the investment decisions. Andrea? So the next one that we want to bring up is this idea of working groups or community tables. So this is kind of something that we've seen, and it was spearheaded by Market Creek Plaza, which is a real estate development in San Diego early in the 2000s or so, where specialized groups made up of kind of a variety of community stakeholders, could be residents, could be nonprofit organizations. Sometimes you have community developers like CDCs coming into these tables and really kind of working on specific issues for a longer period of time. This gives a lot of autonomy and specialization to these community experts on a particular area. So that's one of the benefits of it, is kind of having a small group of people working for a while. But there have definitely been cases, we heard this in the Market Creek Plaza example, of this idea of fatigue, of kind of working for a long time, especially for folks who are doing other community organizing work, have families. This is sometimes volunteer work. So we definitely acknowledge that folks who are doing this kind of work through a community table or and some of the other models we'll get to could or should be paid for their time. That's a really live conversation in this work, and how do you like properly acknowledge the effort that needs to go in to do all of this decision making. Another potential issue with the working groups or community tables is that you can sometimes get some very outspoken individuals taking charge, and power dynamics, as in any group decision making space, can take their toll on the ability for a group to make democratic decisions or to really like reflect the broader community. If there's, say, someone from a more powerful neighborhood organization who has stronger words and really wants to steer the table towards one direction. So that's definitely something that comes up in these spaces, but there have been several projects that have used this organization method really well. Spark is another one that we looked at that also offers this kind of community table method and brings together a wide group of stakeholders. Next slide. So a common tool that folks are probably familiar with is just governing boards. So, boards of nonprofits, companies, funds, there's, this is a very common structure. In GCEI, what we're looking at is how are boards of organizations representing the communities they're serving, of course. So that could be a mix of grassroots stakeholders, which could be, tenants of a building being invested in, residents in a given community, businesses being invested in. And we're looking at, are they a majority of the stakeholders on a board, or just one of the many voices that could include investors, developers, CDFIs maybe. And some are separate entities that kind of form an accountability mechanism. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And some even have elections from a broader membership. So that's really important to note because, it's not, most projects actually have a mix of all these different tools. It's really not kind of like a one size fits all sort of thing. So with these governing boards, they're making most decisions. So there's a lot of commitment and consistency amongst the members who are serving on a governing board. That can be very helpful, but as you can imagine, that also can lead to that kind of fatigue. And requires a very high level of commitment from folks who are serving on the governing board. And each project kind of has their own way of figuring out terms and how long and who is going to be representing the community on the board. But it can be definitely difficult to figure out that mix early on. As an example, and I know Adriana from Kensington Corridor Trust is here on the call today. They have a governing board. Hi, Adriana. They have a governing board that does consist of multiple stakeholders, including some of the community members, businesses. Adriana, please weigh in if I am missing some groups. But what is really interesting to see is that they had some developers who were helping to found the trust. And then over time, they actually transitioned to majority community ownership because that was really part of the goals of the organization to really have that deep representation. And I know there's probably a whole process behind, how to enact that and how to sequence that transition and figure out who needs to be on the board to make it truly reflective of the communities that the trust is serving. Andrea? So we have this next one, decentralized decision making, which we kind of invented for co-op capital. I know Jamie's on the call today to talk about that, if there are any questions on this model. But this is kind of reflecting a lending program where there are community partners who help to bring in borrowers, vet borrowers, and facilitate the loan process. Usually there's kind of a back-end financial partner who helps house the loan. So in the example of co-op capital, there's a credit union, Nusenda, and this is taking place in New Mexico. So Nusenda is a credit union that kind of helps to form the back end and facilitate the loans, but community partners which is a variety of organizations from my understanding. There's some other lenders, there's nonprofit organizations, business associations, who help to bring in borrowers and find folks based on their prior relationships to really facilitate that investment. And that really gets the locus of kind of figuring out who gets capital out of the traditional lender and towards folks who have deeper ties with the communities that they're serving. And so that's a really positive benefit of this, and it avoids some of the issues with credit checks and having kind of these exclusionary practices that are very common, even in mission-driven investments, just business as usual. But this model really says we're going to focus on relationships rather than some of these traditional indicators of who is worthy of a loan. So that's a really important part of this model. And it requires definitely that really strong financial partner who can kind of service the loans and be that core partner, which is definitely not the norm and requires going above and beyond from that lender perspective. So we're definitely interested in folks who are in the community development investment industry and interested in doing this kind of relationship-based investment. And then our last model here that we're going to talk about is really about listening and surveys and gathering input from the communities. So this is usually taking place when an institution like a funder, investor, CDFI wants to do a project and then is looking for ways to bring in voices before doing a kind of investment, and then acting on all of that input. So that could be, where to place a development, what kinds of businesses should be part of the fund's investment strategy. Can be a very wide scope of decision making, and that is often built off of prior relationships within a given community. But I think there's a lot of work that a lot of CDFIs and other lenders can do to build those relationships, and there's understandably a lot of trust issues with some prior lenders. So a successful surveying session, listening session definitely is like really trying to integrate into existing networks. So whether that's going to churches, community gatherings. The example here, we have the East Portland Community Investment Trust. I think they were going to farmers markets. I know I read that in your report. And we have John Haynes from Mercy Corp who helped put together the East Portland CIT. So really trying to talk to folks and really gather input to help decide how that capital is going to be invested and what the project looks like. That's definitely more of a funder or investor initiated model compared to the other ones, but still definitely going above and beyond the usual investment practice. All right, Andrea. So really quickly, we wanted to shout out this really awesome tool by facilitating power and a variety of other partners, including Movement Strategy Center, Building Healthy Communities. This tool builds off of kind of a long history of talking about power in a variety of spaces, particularly community development and policy. And as you can see, there's kind of a spectrum here from ignoring communities all the way to deferring and transferring ownership to communities. We just wanted to throw this up to kind of make the point that not all of the methods that we're talking about here are the same, and some have elements across the spectrum, and some are investing more heavily in being more deferring and trying to grant more ownership and governance to grassroots stakeholders. And that's not to dismiss models that don't go as deep. It's really, there's a lot of really good reasons for projects to say, we're going to offer a certain level of governance, but we need to act now. Maybe there's a real estate opportunity to buy a lot, and then we can figure out the transfer of governance afterwards. That's something we see in many projects, is that they're interested in deepening community ownership and decision-making over time. I mentioned Kensington Corridor Trust kind of adding more community stakeholders to their board over time. I know that in the East Portland CIT example, when we talked to them a while back, they're interested in adding more community stakeholders to the governing board of that development project, which is a commercial development in Portland. So it's definitely possible to kind of move from one end of the spectrum over time towards that more deep collaborative and deferring end. So we can definitely share this tool out for folks if they're interested. We'll make sure to include that in the follow-up. Andrea? So lastly, we just wanted to mention some of the considerations because there was a lot of stuff in what I was just reflecting back. And I think there are a lot of really juicy questions that hopefully we can get into here around this concept of voice and vote and how it manifests in all these different projects. So when we talk about grassroots representation, this is a really tricky subject, and there's no consensus answer of, who is the grassroots, who decides who represents the given community. That's a point of tension that all the projects we talk to experience. Even those that are really deeply originated in movements, and the fund is really serving existing movements. There's not always kind of a consensus of, oh, these folks should be on the board because they are the community, whatever that is. And each project kind of defines their constituents in the way that they, that they are originating. But within this idea of grassroots representation is concepts like, is there a majority of grassroots folks compared to, say, funders or investors making decisions? What types of community members are we serving? Could be residents of a given neighborhood. It could be tenants of a building in some cases. East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative has tenants of some of their housing investments on their governance board. It could be recipients of a loan. Some of our funds that we looked at having loan recipients being part of the decision making, or it could be local grassroots organizations that are kind of staples in the given community. So these are kind of like all different types of groups that we see doing this work, and it's kind of up to the project founders to really figure out how they can represent the community in the best way. And largely, we do see a kind of trade-off between the number of folks being represented, right? Like in the community assemblies, there can be hundreds of members who are coming to the table to make decisions, and then on the other hand, you have kind of a smaller group of organizations, say in a working group. They might be able to make decisions faster in a smaller working group, but they're also not getting as many voices. So that's a trade-off that is also being considered in all of these different projects. So the next consideration is around the scope of decisions. Like, what are folks really deciding on? And what's the relationship with institutional partners like lenders or funders? So you see a really wide range of decisions, and it definitely shows that, with the proper support and governance system, folks who have never really worked in finance or community development can really make these major decisions in a group. So stuff like ongoing management, hiring contractors, making strategic decisions, electing boards, finding pipelines of businesses or other projects to invest in, approving or vetoing investments that are made by a separate investment committee. These are all types of decisions that we see across these different models, the grassroots stakeholders making in these projects. And each kind of governance model structures it differently. So sometimes community groups are working together with funders and investors. We often see that on governance boards that are multi-stakeholder. Several projects we looked at have this kind of multi-stakeholder approach. Some form separate community entities to kind of keep the investors accountable. For example, the Olamina Fund is a national fund that has a community advisory committee, and they are able to veto investments that the board makes if it doesn't kind of align with the principles that they've laid out that are at the core of the fund's investment strategy. So rather than multi-stakeholder all at one table, there's kind of like a separate balance of power there. And in other cases, there's community groups that contract out some functions like lending. The Real People's Fund in the East Bay contracts out to a CDFI and another smaller lender to make those investments, but they kind of work for the grassroots organization. And then lastly here, we have this notion of accountability. So that's really that relational element, how are outside stakeholders being held accountable? That's a really core tenet to a lot of these projects that we're talking about here. So whether that's through veto power, the ability to end relationships or contracts, through electing board members from outside the community to help bring in their expertise, all those aspects lead to this accountability that is really important because I think across all the projects, the grassroots stakeholders are not making all of the decisions. So how expertise from the outside is brought in and how they're kept accountable is really central to how the voices of the community are really central to the project and how it aligns with their existing goals. So lastly, before we get into our Q&A for the rest of the session, we just wanted to quickly cover some of the features that we found in talking to folks on the ground that led to the success of these projects. So like what aspects were really important to these models succeeding. So we have community organizing being a really important part, perhaps not surprisingly. Those that are able to build the most power are those that kind of have these prior relationships with networks, key organizations, with residents. And that's really central in these projects that are emerging from the bottom up that really have, that really created the project in service of the movement rather than outsiders kind of coming in with an idea and then bringing folks in. But that's not to say that those latter examples can't bring in that community organizing aspect, but it requires a lot more thought and care in building those relationships. Another key factor is that the presence of leadership in the community is really important. So having core partners that really can take a lot of that organizing work, getting the project off the ground, and figuring out how to bring in a wide group of stakeholders is really important. Like I mentioned, it requires a lot of commitment from these leaders. And it definitely can be a whole nother job on top of what they're already doing. And that's something that really needs to be navigated and appreciated. So that's where funders come in and providing stipends or creating flexible spaces to do this multi-stakeholder collaboration. Another important factor is long-term philanthropic support, not just being dependent on one funder, but really having the backbone for operations, for giving movement building grants that help support a project beyond just the project itself. Those are really, really important for project success. And also that requires a lot of actors, like a local ecosystem of support. Like the projects that seem to kind of get off the ground fastest have CDFI partners, community foundations, potentially government support from the local government, whether that's a city or state. These are all really important factors that can really make or break a project. So with that, we just wanted to kind of focus on what makes projects successful, but want to acknowledge again that we have a bunch of folks on the call who are doing this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea to lead us into a Q&A and a discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Kurt, for covering so much in a pretty short amount of time. There is a lot of richness there. And once again, thanks to all the folks that have done the hard work of experimenting with these models and really trying to find the right fit in terms of governance for their projects and especially for their communities. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Q&A and discussion. We have with us Adriana from Kensington Corridor Trust, John Haynes from the East Portland Community Investment Trust, Sierra from Boston Ujima Project, Jami from Co-op Capital, and there might be a couple of others that I didn't see on the list right now. Forgive me for that. Kurt, you can drop those names in the chat. If you want, you can write in the question or just raise your hand, and we'll bring you in. So I see a question for us already from Ellen Shepard on what sorts of funders are we finding that are most likely to be willing to shift their decision-making power to communities and to honor the results of community-driven processes. And that actually can serve also as the question can serve as a reminder for me that we will have the next conversation in this series will be precisely on the role of philanthropic funders and philanthropy in supporting this project. That will be with Namaka Agbo, who's the CEO of the Katali Foundation, Jeff Rosen from the Solidago Foundation, and Greg Johnson from the Rockefeller Foundation. From our perspective, Ellen, the type of funders that that we are seeing that are interested in this, and again, some of them are also on the line. I don't want to call them out specifically, but there are some that have experimented because they come at it from a perspective of alignment with their values. So there might be social justice funders that say, actually, in the same way as they follow the dictum from the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, in a lot of their other conversations, of their other activities, they view that as an important part of their support for community investments as well. Some do it from a belief, which we also share, that this is the right way to do it, even just in terms of results. So there was one example of a foundation that had very intentionally sought to do investments in a particular area of interest in Central California, and realized that they would have achieved better results, more impact, if they had had deeper engagement, and that eventually moved them towards decision making. So this tend to be the more nimble foundations often, and yes, it is largely foundations and some family offices. As in the case of Market Creek Plaza, I started from a family foundation. Community foundations have been quite active in this shift, but also CDFIs. And I know Devin Culbertson is with us today from Spark, and some of the CDFIs have really been moving towards this deeper type of work. If anyone wants to add anything to that, again, feel free to raise your hand or put it in there. Okay, let's see here. There is, oh, I see Adriana raised her hand. Thanks, Adriana. Come on in.
Can everybody hear me now? Yes, hi,
yes,
okay.
Great.
So I just wanted to add, for us too, the experience has been that often we will find philanthropy who wants to get behind the model, but are not necessarily already within the social and racial justice, economic justice space, at least not directly. And so I think it's also critical that as we are building out these models, that we bring to the forefront what we need as the community, as the folks who are implementing this work, rather than allowing philanthropy to dictate what it is that they are either accustomed to seeing or used to seeing or prefer to see. And so just really making sure that philanthropy is working for the neighborhood versus the other way around.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And if you don't mind us staying on as panelists. if you're there, great. And let me bring in also Jami. There we go. Hi, Jami.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Awesome.
And also introduce yourself so folks know who you are. Sorry, I forgot to tell Adriana to do so.
Oh, okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jami Gaucher. I work with Rowan Horse Consultant and Native Women Lead. I also work on the Nusenda Co-op Capital project, and just a really neat evolution of the project from a lender at Accion and now being able to design capital projects with Native Women Lead as I've worked through the Co-op Capital. Sorry. But I wanted to answer the question you said about funder, or the question that was asked about funder resources. With Co-op Capital, we actually received support from a large national foundation, a community foundation. And the way that it was modeled and structured is the philanthropic dollars. We needed to collateralize the whole fund or create essentially 100% loan loss reserve to do this pilot. And we had a large foundation back it. We had a community foundation. And the way we initially split it was 70% of the philanthropic dollars covered the collateral fund, 20% was covered by the actual Nusenda, the credit union, and also now a CDFI. And then 10% was actually covered by the partner organizations that we worked with to make the full loan pool 100% collateralized. As a result of the success of the program, Nusenda has actually invested an additional $3 million from the initial $1 million raise to back the program.
Thank you. Great. And let's go through here. So I see a question on the CDFI role from Neha Kapoor. Thank you for that. So someone from a CDFI share who are the people internally in the CDFI that need to be on board for this. Very relevant point that we went over in our work. I'm wondering if somebody in the crowd would like to, that is from a CDFI, would like to raise their hand and address that. Okay, well, Neha, I guess we'll have to get back to you on that. I would have wanted to respond from myself from a CDFI perspective, not to put anyone on the spot there. Oh, hold on, I do see a hand. Okay. Oh, Devin, fantastic. Hi, Devin. Go ahead.
There we go. Am I? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's great. So I work for Enterprise Community Partners. Oh, am I back?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. Technical issues. So I work for Enterprise Community Partners, and we have a CDFI portion, but I work on the program side, and I think that it's really important that often when we think about CDFIs, they get kind of lumped into this broader label. But the program side of the house within Enterprise enables the lending side to be able to work with some of these projects and some of these some of this community infrastructure that requires a lot more time and a lot more bandwidth than is part of the typical CDFI structure. And when you have an entity where kind of the business model is based on sort of completing and closing those loans and moving projects forward, it's hard to find ways for individual staff members to devote that extra time and spend, what we're finding to be often multiple years working with a single project and often much smaller projects to make that happen. So I think that it's often really understanding within that CDFI within that CDFI organization or organization that has the CDFI element, really understanding that there's sort of the program staff that are able to use grant resources to spend those years working with projects and developing that infrastructure and iterating on how that works. And then there's the actual lending team or teams that might use other capital products that would then kind of come into the space and help move that forward. And so I think there's just there's a little bit of nuance in sort of who is doing what and how those partnerships might form up incrementally.
Thank you, Devin, for that. And while we have you on, could I also ask you to address one of the points that that has come up around the choice among these models of governance? So I believe in your work you have looked at several of the different possibilities between the community tables, some of the direct decision making or decision making over the pipeline. Is there anything that you could share with us on why some models seem to work better for some contexts than others?
Yeah, so Spark, the project that I work on, we work with 6 different multi-sector collaboratives, and the projects that we work with come exclusively through those tables. And we don't dictate what their internal process is in terms of project selection and project involvement. And so each of them have developed something a little different. For some, they're really more interested in identifying the project and moving those projects on, and not as interested in some of the details of how the capital comes together and what exact resources are blending in. And that tends to sort of be simple and move quickly and work well for projects, particularly folks that are doing community ownership, really need to do sort of preservation work, need transactions to move quickly because they're trying to sort of buy buildings or buy homes on the open market and need that capital support. Other tables have set up processes where they really want to be able to approve the exact dollar amount of each resource. And so with construction cost escalation, if more dollars need to go in, that would need to then come back for approval another time. And so it really puts folks in a much stronger decision-making role, but it only works well for certain types of projects that have the time to be able to sort of, often come back and add, if depending on the meeting cadence, maybe it's a couple of months in terms of different approval timelines to make that happen. And so we do see community facilities projects that are working well with that, or ground up projects in terms of development. But that model would be much more difficult if you're trying to do sort of open market preservation and things like that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to jump in here and lift up a question from Robert in the chat on how the formal leadership in many communities, especially here in rural Appalachia, are not accustomed to sharing decision-making power in this way. Any suggestions? I wonder if folks who are up on the stage right now, as well as anyone in the crowd who has experience with these projects, especially from the community side, I think that's really interesting and goes to that idea that not all organizations or entities in the given community are or think the same. Everyone is different, and there might not be this like collaborative spirit, or there might not be that kind of like track record to draw upon. So I'm wondering if anyone has suggestions for like how to push folks who are powerful or have a lot of ties in the community to kind of like start that process of decision-making sharing.
Well, with the capital model, the way that we've structured it is from the onset of the design, community was involved from the beginning, and community has consistently been centered as the folks that we are serving. So the interesting structure of the capital is you have the financial institution, which provides the loan administration, also fundraising support, and then you have capacity managers that are kind of providing and designing the fund, supporting the project, the partner organizations, and engaging in new opportunities for additional partners. And then you have the current partner organizations, which are the folks that have the trusted relationships with the borrowers. And then you also have the investors and funders. And it's really interesting how those kind of four groups interact with one another, but the constant push is to center the borrowers and think about it from the lens of from equity and leveraging the gifts of and the offerings that we all have and how we contribute to this, to the success of this pilot, essentially. We work with a number of partner organizations that either have done lending, have never done lending, work with borrowers from very different communities. Like right now, half of our borrowers are Native American, nearly 40% are immigrant population, more than 90% are people of color. So the folks that we work with are really invested in these communities, and we really have intentionally shared power and I think transferred power and given power in different spaces, so that it's the decision making is kind of like woven in a, I don't know, it's not a hierarchy by any means, but it's definitely structured in a very different way. And our thesis is we're challenging the 5 C's of credit too, so that is innately woven in the design.
Well, I saw that there was a question specifically for the Boston Ujima project and the Ujima Fund, but perhaps it's applicable to the other panelists or John Haynes, if you want to jump in. On lessons learned around voice and vote. We documented some of them in the report, but I think it would be even more interesting to hear them directly from those that have been actually doing the work. So if any of you wants to jump in, or Sierra, if you want to jump in, or anybody else that's been involved with Boston Ujima or one of the other projects, please do so. Okay, Sierra, I will promote you. And you'll be able to, now, I just promoted you, you should be able to chat now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you all for having me. Sorry, I've been having some difficulties getting in here, so this is great. Hi everyone, my name is Sierra Peters. I'm the Communications Director at Boston Ujima Project. I think the question was surrounding voice and vote. So I'm just gonna scroll back to it really quickly. But for anyone that doesn't know, the Boston Ujima Project is a cooperative business, arts, and investment ecosystem that's centering the needs and desires of communities of colors in Boston with the mission to return wealth to those communities. So one lesson that we've learned on voice and vote that we would want to share, I think one lesson that I've learned recently is this idea around how people incorporate their vote and their sense of power in that vote. So I think, you know, the previous question about folks in the Appalachia community really spoke to me, because I'm really interested in like how people conceive of their own power. And that's something that we talk about a lot at Ujima. And I think that that comes with a lot of political education. Every Wednesday, we have our political education meetings, financial and political education meetings, where we talk about different subjects, as well as host our, you know, just general community meetings. But I would say, you know, on the purpose or the topic of voice and power, one thing that we did for our members, you know, particularly given that our investments, with our investments, you must be a voting member to vote. So that means, you know, whether you've invested at all, whether you've invested $50 or $100,000, you have one vote as to where the investments go. And in addition to that, you know, you must be a part of the community in order to be a voting member. So you have to be, you know, or in the city of Boston, you know, in the city limits, or you have to be, you know, someone that was recently gentrified out, because we understand the nature of gentrification being what it is. So we particularly target in our messaging that is who we want to hear from. And I'd say in addition to that, how our votes are structured is something that's really interesting for me. So there's not just, you know, when we do have our votes, it's not just like yes or no, should this pass? It's We have actually like 5 ways that you can submit your vote. So it's like, yes, emphatically, yes, but I have some reservations about the businesses or this business. However, I trust you, Jima, to take my messaging or like take my feedback that they would have already been invited to give in the vote, and to research it and to take it and consider it seriously. There's obviously a no vote as well as a abstain, and I add my vote to the majority, or abstain and I don't. And I think that that's really important because it allows people to realize that it's not binary and that there is a wide range of ways that we can consent to what's going to happen in our communities.
Fantastic, thank you, Sierra. Actually, we brought up a case study on the Jima Fund in our report, but there's a lot of other amazing literature on Jima, including their extremely thoughtful impact report that came out recently. So I would encourage everyone to look at that also to learn more. Kurt, over to you.
Yeah, and I see there's only a couple minutes left on the clock here, and the questions coming in here. Andrea copied one other question that came in, and I think we can have that be the last question here on the underwriting or approval guidelines provided to or generated by communities. Does anyone have any insights or kind of stories on like how those approval guidelines were created? I know that a lot of the projects here, Ujima Fund, as well as Jami, the Co-op Capital Project, others like the Real People's Fund, who's not here today, they also had a rigorous process for this. So if folks want to share their experiences either through speaking or the chat, we can wrap up with that one.
I love this question because, like I said before, the Co-op Capital Project is actually the antithesis of the 5 C's, which is, as a lender traditionally trained, what I would do with underwriting with borrowers and entrepreneurs. And we actually empower the grassroots organizations that we work with to develop their own underwriting criteria based on relationship. And that's why the collateralized or loan loss reserve is there. To date, we have less than 1% default, and we consider this product an alternative to the alternative. So we're really looking to source funding to people that cannot access traditional capital, even through a CDFI. So it's really neat because Native Women Lead, the organization I co-founded, we actually are a partner, and we've woven our underwriting through our values and based on the needs of our community. And we also wove in borrower forgiveness, 50% borrower forgiveness as a reward for good payment history. And all of the partner organizations also have TA provided, as well as like financial literacy. So it's been really neat because we're proving that our communities are investable, and now Native Women Lead is actually taking this model forward and using underwriting in the frame of rematriation. So it's pretty cool what's happening, and I know it's hard. We have a CDFI that's really hard to like get out of their like traditional underwriting, and like, what do you mean underwrite it based on our relationship? But it's actually proving to be really insightful and actually non-extractive and non-exploitative in our design.
Awesome, thank you, Jami, and thank you to everyone else who has contributed here. So we'll try to address the remaining questions that we didn't get around to. We packed already quite a lot in 1 hour, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I would say, yeah, there's a lot of experimentation, as you've seen. There are a lot of cool models. We will collect the ones that folks are willing to provide, and we will share them out. Again, we undertook this work as Transform Finance really to start putting a bit of a name to a field, because there were to a practice, because there are a lot of folks doing really interesting work, but many, especially on the capital side, couldn't wrap their head around what this thing was. And the name is not a great one, but you know, GCEI doesn't roll off your tongue, but at least it's very descriptive. And our hope is that now people would say, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing, or that's stuff that I'm interested in supporting philanthropically or otherwise. So I'm glad that you all are on this little journey with us. I hope you will join the follow-on sessions. Again, there will be one around philanthropic practice around GCEI, one on CDFIs. We look at some of the practices of deployment of capital. Today we cover the governance, but we'll look at the modes. So real estate projects, commercial real estate versus housing, enterprise funding, and some of the mixed models that we have seen. And I just want to, again, thank you all for having joined us today. Stay in touch, register for the next ones. Thanks in particular to all the folks that are doing the work, and especially the ones that were willing to share with us today and take some of the questions. So great to see you, Sierra, Jamie, Adriana, Devin, and the others. I really appreciated all that you're doing and all that you shared with us. And we will see you for the next session on the 1st of July at 1 p.m. So please do register for that one as well. You will get an email from us. And get in touch if you have any questions or comments. All right, until the next one. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.